I remember the morning clearly because the coffee maker had broken the night before, and I'd had to drive to the Tim Hortons on Confederation Drive just to get a decent cup before heading out. It was early March, that particular kind of cold that settles into your bones before the sun has had a chance to argue with it. I sat in the parking lot of the storage facility on the edge of town, holding that paper cup with both hands, looking at the roll-up door to Unit 47, the unit that had my name on the lease, the unit that held what remained of 31 years of a life I thought I understood. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I was 63 years old that morning, recently retired from the city's infrastructure planning department, and I had just signed the papers on a property I'd worked toward for the better part of a decade. A secondary dwelling on 2.5 acres outside of Saskatoon. Nothing fancy, a modest bungalow with a detached workshop, a small pond that froze solid from November to April, and enough distance from the nearest neighbor that I could hear myself think. I had paid $480,000 for it. I had been proud of that. I had called my daughter in Halifax the evening of the closing and told her that her old dad had finally done something right. What I didn't know that morning, sitting in that parking lot with my Tim Hortons cup and my quiet satisfaction, was that someone had been inside my new property the previous weekend. Not a stranger, not a trespasser. My son-in-law. The phone rang just as I was finishing the coffee. I didn't recognize the number, but it had a Saskatchewan area code, so I answered. The man on the other end introduced himself as Douglas Fair. He told me he had owned the bungalow on Whitmore Road, which everyone had started calling that as a joke when I bought it, my daughter included, for 11 years before selling it to me. He spoke carefully, the way people speak when they're not sure how the other person is going to react. He said he needed to tell me something, and he asked if I was sitting down. I told him I was in a car. He said that would do. Douglas had installed a trail camera on the back of the detached workshop when he'd lived there, the kind hunters use. Motion-activated, weatherproof, clips to a tree or screws into a wall. He'd used it to monitor deer movement on the back acreage. When he sold me the property, he had intended to take it down, but in the chaos of moving his family to Kelowna, before the roads turned bad in November, he had forgotten about it. The camera was still mounted, it was still motion-activated, and it had taken 4 days' worth of photographs and a 20-minute video clip that Douglas had discovered when he checked the cloud backup on a Sunday afternoon while his grandchildren were visiting. He had not expected to see my son-in-law's truck parked beside my workshop. He had not expected to see my son-in-law and a man he didn't recognize carrying items out of that workshop and loading them into the bed of the truck. He said, "I thought you should know before I did anything else. I don't know you well, Mr. Whitmore, but I know what it looks like when a man's being robbed." I thanked him. I told him not to delete anything. I sat in that parking lot for a long time after we hung up. Let me tell you about my son-in-law, because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what I did next. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, because she is the most important person in this story, and I intend to protect her privacy, had married a man named Trevor Calloway 9 years earlier. Trevor was originally from Moose Jaw, had worked in pipeline inspection for most of his adult life, and had a personality that expanded to fill whatever room he was in. He was funny at dinners. He was generous with compliments. He remembered birthdays and called me by my first name within the first month of knowing me, which I had taken as warmth rather than what it actually was, a rehearsed ease with older men who had things worth having. He and my daughter had 2 children, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. I loved those grandchildren in the way that grandparents love when they have been given the luxury of watching their own child raise a version of themselves. My relationship with Trevor had always been cordial. I had lent him money twice, once when the pipeline contract dried up in 2019, and once when they needed a new vehicle in 2021. Both times he had paid me back, and I had not thought much more about it. What I didn't know until that spring was that Trevor and my daughter had been struggling badly for the better part of 2 years. She had not told me because she did not want me to worry. She had not told me because Trevor had told her the problems were temporary. She had not told me because she still loved him and believed he was trying. He was not trying in the way she thought. I want to pause here and tell you something I have learned at 63 years old that I wish someone had told me at 40. The people most capable of long deception are rarely the ones who seem obviously dishonest. They are the ones who have built enough goodwill over enough time that even when small things don't add up, you round the number down rather than look more carefully at the arithmetic. Trevor had been rounding numbers down for years. I just hadn't known I was the ledger. After Douglas Fear's phone call, I drove out to the property. I did not call Trevor. I did not call my daughter. I drove the 40 minutes in silence with the radio off, which is unusual for me. I am a man who has had CBC Radio 1 on for so long that the presenters' voices feel like members of my extended family. But that morning I needed quiet. The workshop was locked when I arrived, which I had expected since I had the only set of keys I believed to exist. Except the lock had been changed. My key no longer fit. I stood there in the cold, looking at a padlock I had never purchased on a door to a building I owned, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as the particular grief of realizing you trusted someone more than you should have. I did not break the lock. I photographed it. I took photographs of the tire tracks in the mud beside the workshop door. I walked around the back of the building and found Douglas's camera exactly where he'd told me it would be screwed into a board just under the roof eave, angled toward the workshop door and the driveway. I did not touch it. Then I drove to the lawyer's office in town. My lawyer had done my real estate closing and had known me professionally for 4 years. She was a thorough woman who asked twice as many questions as most people and had a habit of letting silences stretch past the point of comfort until the other person felt compelled to fill them with honesty. I have always admired that. I sat across from her and told her everything Douglas had told me, and I laid my phone on her desk so she could see the photographs I'd taken that morning. She looked at everything carefully. Then she said, "Don't change that lock back. Don't confront him. Don't tell your daughter until we know exactly what's missing and what he has." I asked her why. She said, "Because right now you have documentation of what was done. If you confront him today, all you have is a conversation." That sentence has stayed with me. The following 2 days were among the most difficult of my life, not because of what I was doing, which was mostly waiting, but because of what I was not doing, which was calling my daughter. I spoke to her on the phone that Tuesday about a birthday card I needed to send her youngest, and I sat through that conversation, knowing what I knew and keeping my voice steady. And I want you to understand that this was not manipulation or cruelty. This was the deliberate act of protecting her from incomplete information. A half-told truth about the man she had built her life with would have caused damage I could not yet control. My lawyer contacted Douglas Fair and arranged to receive a copy of all camera files, the photographs, and the video clip. The video was 22 minutes long. Douglas had been right about what it showed. Trevor's truck arrived on a Saturday afternoon, 2 days after I had taken possession of the property, but before I had moved anything into the workshop, which meant what he was taking had already been there. The previous owner, Douglas, had left several items behind. When he moved to Kelowna, items he had sold to me as part of the property contents. 2 vintage Ski-Doo sleds from the late 1970s, fully restored, a compressor and set of pneumatic tools, shelving units of specialty fasteners and hardware that Douglas had collected over decades, a generator still in its original casing. We had valued these contents at $18,000 during the sale negotiation. Trevor had known about them because I had mentioned them at Christmas dinner, describing the property to anyone who would listen the way people do when they've done something they're proud of. He had made a copy of my key before I had the locks changed. The man with him, identified later through the investigation as a private buyer Trevor had already arranged, helped load the 2 Ski-Doos onto a flatbed trailer. The compressor went into the truck bed, wrapped in moving blankets. 4 boxes of hardware. The generator, the camera caught all of it. Timestamp, faces, vehicle plates. My lawyer filed a report with the RCMP. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I think it matters. I did not make that call out of spite or vengeance. I made it because what Trevor had done was theft. From me, yes, but also, in a different way. From my daughter, from my grandchildren, from the future I had worked to build partly with them in mind. And if I allowed it to go unaddressed, I would be teaching everyone involved, including myself, that it was tolerable. The investigating officer was professional and methodical. She reviewed the camera footage, the documentation of the lock change, and a statement from Douglas Fair, who agreed to cooperate fully from Kelowna. The private buyer, when contacted, surrendered the Ski-Doos quickly. He had paid Trevor $6,000 for them, and was more interested in not being charged as a receiver of stolen goods than in keeping machines he'd had for less than a week. Trevor was charged with break and enter and theft, over $5,000. Now I need to tell you about the conversation with my daughter, because this is the part of the story that people don't usually include, and I think it's the most important part. I drove to her home on a Wednesday evening. It was the kind of early spring evening in Saskatchewan where the light goes long and golden at around 6 o'clock, and you can almost convince yourself winter is finished, even when you know it isn't. I had called ahead to ask if the children were sleeping. She said they were in bed but not yet asleep. I told her I needed to talk to her, and that it was important. She heard something in my voice that she recognized as serious, because she met me at the door with her coat still on, as though she'd been waiting. We sat at her kitchen table. Trevor was not home. I told her everything in the order it had happened. The phone call from Douglas, the drive out to the property, the changed lock, the lawyer, the camera footage, the RCMP. I did not editorialize. I did not tell her what to feel or what to do. I laid the facts on the table the way you'd lay out a map and let a person find their own bearings. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I told her 4 days. She nodded slowly. She didn't ask why I had waited, which told me she already understood the answer. What followed in the weeks after that was hard in the way that honest things are hard, not sharp and sudden, but long and heavy. My daughter made her own decisions about her marriage. That is not my story to tell here, and I will respect it by not telling it. What I will tell you is that she was braver than I had given her credit for, which is a failing in fathers, and perhaps in most people who love someone and confuse protection with underestimating them. The legal process for Trevor took several months. He eventually pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of theft over $5,000. He paid restitution not to me, but into the arrangement my lawyer structured to flow toward my daughter's household account, which I insisted upon. The skidoos were returned. The generator was recovered. Most of the hardware was accounted for. The compressor was not. It had apparently been sold privately before the investigation concluded, and Trevor either could not or would not say where. I replaced the compressor myself. It was less about the object and more about the principle of not letting an empty space in my workshop become a daily reminder of what had happened there. I want to tell you about the morning I finally moved properly into that property. It was late April by then, past the worst of the mud season, and I had backed a rented trailer up the laneway and spent most of a Saturday carrying boxes into the bungalow, while a friend from my old department helped me dismantle some shelving in the workshop and rebuild it according to what I actually needed. We had brought coffee from Tim Hortons. I had a particular feeling about that brand by then, and at one point we sat outside on the step of the workshop in the afternoon sun, and I looked out at the pond, which still had ice at its edges but was open in the middle where the depth kept the cold from reaching, and I thought about the strange way that damage and rebuilding can happen inside the same season. My grandchildren came to visit in May. The boy, who was 7, wanted to know why there were tire tracks beside the workshop that I hadn't planted anything over yet. I told him that someone had parked there once, and that we were going to plant wild grass over the whole area in June, so that by July you wouldn't know anything had ever happened there. He thought about that and then asked if we could put a birdhouse on the workshop eave where Douglas's camera had been. I told him that was an excellent idea. We put the birdhouse up together that afternoon. He chose a cedar one from the farm supply store in town, and we mounted it at a height he approved of, and by the end of June there was a pair of tree swallows using it. My granddaughter named them Gerald and Doreen. Gerald after me, and Doreen after a character in a book she was reading. I have not yet told her that Doreen was actually a tree swallow, not a person, but I intend to let her figure that out on her own when she's ready. There are things I know now that I want to say plainly, without dressing them up, because I think plainness is what experience eventually earns you. The first is this: documentation is not cold or unfeeling. It is, in fact, one of the most responsible things you can do when you discover that someone you trusted has taken something from you. The impulse to confront, to shout, to demand an explanation in the heat of the moment. I understand that impulse completely. I have felt it. But emotion spent in confrontation is often evidence thrown away. My lawyer was right. A conversation is not a record. A timestamp is. The second is this: the people who take from you are rarely strangers. They are people who have studied you long enough to know what you have, what you value, and what you are unlikely to check on. This is not a reason to distrust everyone around you. It is a reason to pay attention. Quiet attention, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The third is something I learned specifically from watching my daughter navigate what came after, and it is the thing I am most grateful I witnessed. The person who is deceived is not responsible for the deception. This sounds obvious. It is not, in practice, obvious at all. My daughter spent several weeks carrying a weight she had no reason to carry, the weight of wondering whether she had missed signs, whether she had been foolish, whether she should have known. I want to say clearly, to anyone listening who has felt that same weight, someone else's dishonesty is not your failure of perception. Some people are simply practiced at making themselves believable. The remedy for that is not to become permanently suspicious. It is to act clearly and calmly when the truth eventually surfaces, and the truth, in my experience, reliably surfaces. The fourth is about property and what it represents. $480,000 is not a number I arrived at casually. It is the compounded result of decades of showing up to work on mornings when I didn't want to, of making careful decisions, of forgoing things I wanted in favor of things I needed, of planning in the particular methodical way that is perhaps less exciting than other approaches, but tends, over the long run, to produce results. When someone violates that, they are not only taking an object or a dollar amount, they are taking a portion of the time those resources represent. I think people should understand this clearly when they consider whether a theft is serious or minor. Time is not recoverable. The fifth is perhaps the most personal, and I offer it with the acknowledgement that it may not apply to everyone in the way it applies to me. I am 63 years old. I spent 31 years in a government department doing work that was useful, but rarely visible. I attended many meetings. I filed many reports. I mentored people who went on to positions I had wanted and did not get. I am not bitter about this. I made my choices, but I want to say that the bungalow on 2.5 acres outside of Saskatoon was, in a way that I find difficult to explain without sounding more sentimental than I usually permit myself, the first thing I had built entirely for myself. Not for a department, not for a committee, not even for my family, though they benefit from it. For me, for the version of myself that still wants to hear the ice crack on a pond in April and drink bad coffee beside a workshop at 6 in the morning. Someone tried to take from that, and they did not succeed. The birdhouse is still there. The swallows came back this spring. I don't know if they're the same pair or new tenants, but my granddaughter insists they are Gerald and Doreen, and I have decided not to complicate her certainty with ornithology. Some convictions are worth keeping unchallenged. If you're watching this and you've found yourself in a situation that feels like mine, where someone you extended trust to has used that extension against you, I want you to know that the instinct to absorb it quietly and move on is understandable, but it is not the only option. Document what you can. Speak to someone who knows how to handle it properly. Give the people around you the credit of being able to handle the truth when it's presented with care. And if you're watching this simply because you needed an hour that felt like someone else's life making sense in the end, I hope this one did that for you. Thank you for being here.